Have you ever wondered how certain world leaders can just commit blatant human rights violations, shatter international laws, and completely disregard every moral code we have, yet they still remain absolutely untouchable in their power?
Yeah, it defies our modern sense of justice, right?
Exactly. I mean, we expect this sort of cosmic balancing of the scales, but the reality, more often than not, is actually the exact opposite.
Right.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the blueprint behind that reality. Our sources for this are excerpts that detail the insights from a 500-year-old guidebook.
A very infamous guidebook.
Yeah, written specifically for ruthless leaders. Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack the actual unvarnished mechanics of power politics. We're exploring how power is, seized and maintained in the real world when you strip away all the idealism.
And I mean, Machiavelli's theories are incredibly blunt. The source text we're analyzing today applies his historical lens to some highly polarizing real-world examples just to show how these mechanics still operate today.
Right, because human nature doesn't really change.
Exactly. It brings up figures and nations from across the modern political spectrum, from the United States and Israel to China and North Korea. But just as a quick reminder for you listening, our goal here is not to take a political side.
Definitely, yeah.
We aren't endorsing any of these actions or making moral judgments on the events mentioned. We are strictly popping the hood on these historical and political theories to help you understand how Machiavelli's brutal logic translates to the world stage.
Right, we're just looking at the engine and seeing how the gears turn.
Yeah.
And to set the stage for this, the core thesis Machiavelli presents is that, well, in the arena of power, morality is a luxury you simply cannot afford.
It's a completely different operating system.
Yeah. Forget about what is right or wrong in your daily life. For Machiavelli, politics is a dirty, high-stakes game, and the ends justify the means. If protecting your power requires cruelty, war, or deception, he doesn't view those as, unfortunate accidents.
No, he views them as baseline requirements of the job.
Right.
He essentially separates personal ethics from statecraft entirely. I mean, the abstract idea of seizing power is one thing, but Machiavelli is obsessed with the immediate practical problem of holding on to it.
Which is the harder part, really.
Absolutely. So imagine you are a Renaissance prince or, a modern authoritarian, and you have just conquered a new territory.
Right.
To the people living there, you are not a legitimate ruler.
You're an invader.
Exactly. You're an invader who took their land by force. So Machiavelli asks this crucial question: how do you stop a rebellion from brewing the absolute second you turn your back?
Because friction is inevitable, right? I mean, you're an outsider, forcing a new reality on them.
Precisely. And he gives a very specific mechanical blueprint for occupying these new territories. His first rule is that the conquering leader should ideally move and live in the new territory personally.
Wait, just pack up the central government and relocate.
Yes. The underlying logic there is twofold. First, when people see their ruler living among them, it can create a strange sense of connection, or at least familiarity.
Sure.
But more strategically, your physical presence acts as a massive deterrent.
Because you're right there.
Right. It makes it incredibly hard for enemies, either foreign or domestic, to organize a rebellion because the apparatus of power is watching them locally. The source text actually brings up the British occupation of India as a counterexample.
Oh, how so?
Well, the British tried to rule an enormous subcontinent from thousands of miles away via proxies, and that massive distance left gaps, making control incredibly difficult and vulnerable to uprisings.
That makes sense.
Contrast that with a modern example the text provides: China's Xi Jinping and his strategy in Hong Kong. To suppress local dissent and ensure the territory remains under central control, he hasn't just issued edicts from Beijing.
Right.
The strategy has been to maintain a massive, unyielding political and security presence right there on the ground. The physical proximity just suffocates the oxygen a rebellion needs.
But practically speaking, a leader can't be everywhere at once. If you conquer multiple territories, you physically cannot live in all of them.
Which brings us to rule number 2. If you cannot be there, you must send a colony of your own people to live there. The mechanism here is a slow-motion transformation of the local population. By introducing a critical mass of your own citizens into the new territory, the locals eventually have to interact with them, do business with them.
And slowly adopt your culture.
Exactly. Your culture, your habits, and your systems of loyalty.
It's funny. If you've ever sat in a corporate restructuring meeting and watched a new CEO immediately clear out the old executives and bring in their own hand-picked management team, You've essentially watched this exact rule play out.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, like you can't just send an email from headquarters saying you're in charge now. You have to move your office into their building or fill their management team with your own people. Otherwise, the old employees will just quietly revolt and sabotage your initiatives.
That analogy fits perfectly because it highlights the necessity of changing the DNA of the environment. The text cites European colonizers across Africa as a prime historical example of this demographic and cultural engineering.
Right.
It also points to the way settlements have been used in establishing the State of Israel as a mirror of this exact strategy. You blend or replace the population until your rule simply becomes the inescapable new normal.
Wow. Okay, so that handles the population on the ground. But keeping the locals in check only solves half the problem, right? You still have peer competitors, other rival leaders, looking at your newly acquired territory with envy.
Oh, always.
So if you've secured the ground, how does Machiavelli suggest you handle the rivals who are plotting against you?
You have to build coalitions, and the strategy Machiavelli outlines is to actively offer protection to the weaker leaders nearby.
It's almost like a mafia protection racket. You become their shield.
It relies on the exact same psychological leverage. Weaker neighbors are already terrified of being swallowed by a massive superpower. When you step in and offer to protect them, they naturally become your allies.
They become dependent on you.
Exactly. Together, you form a coalition capable of standing against a major superpower, but you remain the undisputed head of that coalition. The classic example from our sources is the Cold War.
Oh, with NATO.
Yes, the United States protected smaller nations in Europe from the Soviet Union. Those nations needed the U.S. security umbrella, which naturally led to the formation of the NATO alliance. You secure your own overarching power by making weaker players fundamentally dependent on your strength.
That makes perfect sense for managing existing superpowers. But what about the threats that aren't quite super yet? The ones flying under the radar, just quietly building their strength.
Well, for those, Machiavelli advocates dealing with future threats while they are small. The source text compares this to a vaccine. You treat the disease before it multiplies and kills the patient. You do not wait for the problem to arrive fully formed at your doorstep.
I mean, calling it a vaccine makes it sound so clinical and clean.
It does.
But in reality, we're talking about preemptive warfare and eliminating human lives based on what might happen.
It is incredibly dark. But Machiavelli argues that waiting for a threat to mature is fatal. The text highlights Kim Jong-un's tendency to quickly eliminate anyone, even family members he perceives, as a potential threat to his regime long before they can organize a coup.
Right, striking first.
And on an international scale, the source discusses how countries like the United States and Israel approach Iran's nuclear capabilities. They aren't waiting for a finished armed weapon to be sitting on a launch pad.
They actively attack the potential of that weapon.
Exactly, disrupting supply chains, neutralizing scientists, launching cyber attacks. The ancient Romans utilized the exact same logic when they conquered Greece. They systematically suppressed any local leader showing even a hint of ambition before they could gain enough influence to challenge Roman authority.
Looking at it that way, it means a leader has to live in a state of constant, exhausting paranoia, just scanning the horizon for threats that haven't even materialized yet. Does that level of vigilance eventually just break a ruler?
That's a great question. And that exact exhaustion depends entirely on the architecture of the government the leader has built.
Okay, how so?
Machiavelli points out that some systems require you to sleep with one eye open forever, while other systems actually do the heavy lifting for you. We can see this clearly by looking at a historical structural failure versus a structural success.
Okay, walk us through the failure first. How does a system actively work against a ruler?
Let's look at King Louis XII of France. He successfully conquered northern Italy, but then he ignored all the structural rules we just covered.
He didn't move there.
He didn't relocate there, he didn't send colonies, he actively alienated the minor nobles in the region. The mechanism of his failure was the French governance model itself, which Machiavelli calls the ruler-baron system.
The ruler-baron system.
Right. In this setup, the king rules, but he is surrounded by nobles, barons who have their own independent power bases. They have their own wealth, their own armies, and subjects who are loyal to the baron, not the king.
So the king isn't the only one with leverage. The barons have their own gravity.
Exactly. And that makes the system incredibly unstable. Those barons can challenge the king whenever they feel slighted. If an invader comes along, the invader doesn't have to fight the whole country at once.
You just pick off the angry barons.
Yes, they can easily bribe or flatter a few dissatisfied barons to flip sides. Because power is decentralized, the ruler-baron system is very easy to invade. But it is nearly impossible to hold once you've conquered it because you can never truly trust those barons. Louis XII lost northern Italy almost as quickly as he gained it.
So the ruler-baron system is essentially a Jenga tower.
Oh, I like that.
Every block wants to be the top piece, and they all have their own structural weight. You pull one dissatisfied baron out, and the whole regime falls. What is the alternative system that actually holds up?
The alternative is the ruler-servant system. And to build on your analogy, this system is a solid block of concrete.
Concrete? Okay.
In a ruler-servant structure, the prince meticulously eliminates anyone with independent power, wealth, or ambition. He completely clears the board of rivals. The only people left in high administrative positions are completely dependent on the prince for their status.
They have nothing else.
Right. They have no independent wealth or loyal subjects. They are strictly loyal servants of the state.
Because if the ruler falls, they lose everything too. There's no incentive for them to betray the leader to an invader because an invader would just replace them anyway.
Precisely. It is highly centralized. Because there are no disgruntled barons to bribe, a ruler-servant system is incredibly difficult to invade. But if an invader does manage to conquer it by sheer force, it is actually very easy to hold. The central authority has already done the work of subduing the population and eliminating rivals.
Who successfully pulled this off? Like, who built the concrete block?
Alexander the Great. He conquered the vast Persian kingdom and then died suddenly in 323 BC. Everyone expected his new empire to collapse instantly without him. But it didn't.
Really?
The Macedonians maintained control for years. Why? Because the previous Persian king, Darius, had already built a ruler-servant system. Darius had centralized all power and turned the major leaders into dependent loyalists.
So the concrete was already set.
When Alexander took over and eliminated Darius, that solid block of concrete was already poured. The bureaucratic machinery just transferred its loyalty to the new top guy.
That's fascinating.
And our sources point out that the modern Chinese Communist Party operates with shades of this exact system. High-ranking officials derive their power strictly from the central leadership. They don't have independent regional armies. The central authority holds the exclusive power of promotion, effectively removing the independent leverage that a baron would have.
So if the system is the vehicle, what kind of driver is required to operate it? Because managing a Jenga tower or pouring that concrete requires a very specific set of psychological traits.
Machiavelli boils the necessary traits of a successful leader down to two main concepts: virtue and fortune. But we have to completely redefine how we use those words today.
Okay, how so?
Virtue, in Machiavelli's world, does not mean being an ethical, good, or moral person. It translates closer to raw effectiveness, having courage, strategic vision, and a strong, unyielding character.
It's competence and willpower, not saintliness.
Yes. And fortune simply means luck, circumstance, or timing. Machiavelli argues you absolutely need both. If your timing is off, all the virtue in the world will not save you.
Right.
The text cites the ancient myth of Romulus. If he hadn't been abandoned and cast out as a child, he never would have been in the desperate position required to establish Rome. The fortune of his abandonment provided the canvas for his virtue. Or, look at a modern example cited in the text. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. He came from a humble background far outside the traditional political dynasties. But when fortune presented the right political climate and public appetite for change, he had the virtue, the unyielding character, and strategic ruthlessness to capitalize on it. You have to be the ultimate opportunist.
And sometimes capitalizing on an opportunity involves making choices that are deeply unsettling. Which leads us to Machiavelli's calculus of cruelty. This is arguably the most notorious part of his entire philosophy.
It is the advice that earned him his dark reputation, without a doubt. Machiavelli argues that if a ruler determines that cruelty is strictly necessary to secure their power, they must execute that cruelty all at once. Be swift, be massive, and be absolute.
But why all at once? Why not portion it out?
Because the goal is psychological shark. You want to stun the population into submission so quickly and overwhelmingly that they do not even have time to process the horror or organize a resistance. And then, and this is the vital mechanical part, you must stop the cruelty entirely. You pivot back to normalcy. Machiavelli warns that dispensing small doses of cruelty over a long period is the quickest way to destroy your own regime.
It's the difference between a sudden trauma and a chronic lingering pain, like ripping off a Band-Aid, but with incredibly dark real-world consequences.
Exactly.
Because human psychology can adapt to a single terrible event in the past and eventually accept the new stable reality. But if the cruelty is ongoing, if people are constantly disappearing, or daily life is just a string of petty abuses, the wound never closes. The fear turns into a daily burning hatred. And people who are pushed into a corner with nothing left to lose will inevitably rebel.
That is exactly the mechanism. Nagging cruelty makes people hate you, and hatred is fatal to a ruler. Now, to be fair to the text, Machiavelli does offer an alternative to sudden cruelty. You do not have to use violence to secure the state.
Okay, what's the alternative?
You can also maintain ironclad control through extreme prosperity and protection.
So basically buying the population's loyalty by giving them a life they don't want to lose.
Exactly. If the citizens are safe, their businesses are thriving, and their families are secure, they will naturally support the ruler, even if that ruler holds absolute, unquestioned power.
Does the text give an example of that?
It does. It cites Lee Kuan Yew's success in Singapore. He provided such unparalleled security and explosive economic growth that the people gave him their unwavering support, allowing him to maintain incredibly tight control over the state without needing to resort to the brutal shock tactics Machiavelli is famous for.
But whether a ruler relies on the shock of sudden cruelty or the golden handcuffs of lasting prosperity, they still need tangible tools to enforce their will. You can't just mandate fear or wealth out of thin air. To make either strategy work, a ruler needs two things: a military and a treasury.
Right, and Machiavelli insists that a prince must master the art of war, even in times of total peace. Because the baseline reality of this world is conflict. Most rulers gain power through war, and they lose it the exact same way.
Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Exactly. The source brings up Adolf Hitler. He expanded his power exponentially through the sheer brute force of the Second World War. The military machine built his empire. But because war was his only true tool, that exact same war became his complete undoing. A ruler must always be preparing for the next conflict, studying the terrain and maintaining the military.
But who exactly is fighting that war? Because Machiavelli has very strict rules about who you hand the weapons to.
He is aggressively clear on this point. Never trust mercenaries.
Never.
Mercenaries are essentially independent contractors. They fight for a paycheck, they do not fight for your nation's survival, and they certainly don't fight for you personally. Machiavelli points out a glaring flaw in their incentive structure.
Which he says,
when a battle is easy, they take your money. But when a battle gets truly dangerous and they face actual death, a mercenary will do a quick cost-benefit analysis and realize the paycheck isn't worth their life. They will desert you, or worse, they will turn on you if the enemy offers a higher bid.
They have zero stake in the game.
Exactly. The text uses Muammar Gaddafi in Libya as a prime modern example of this failure. He relied heavily on imported mercenaries to enforce his rule. But when the revolution came and the situation became genuinely perilous, those mercenaries proved completely unreliable.
Because they had no reason to die for him.
Exactly. They had no ideological or personal reason to die for Gaddafi. Machiavelli argues the only military force a ruler can truly trust is a citizen army, people who are defending their own homes, their own families, and their own way of life.
But equipping and feeding a massive citizen army requires an enormous amount of capital. And this is where Machiavelli's financial advice gets really fascinating, because it seems totally counterintuitive. He actually advises leaders to be stingy. He tells them to hoard their wealth.
He does.
But wait, doesn't being seen as a cheapskate immediately breed resentment among the public? People want a leader who builds grand monuments and throws lavish festivals.
They do, and that is exactly the trap. Machiavelli is warning leaders against the mathematical reality of generosity. If a ruler is constantly generous, hosting massive events, giving out handouts, funding endless projects, they will inevitably drain the state's treasury.
Right.
And when the money runs out, the ruler is in a terrible bind. To refill the coffers, to pay the army, and keep the state running, the ruler has to do the one thing that guarantees public outrage: raise taxes.
So buying their love in the short term guarantees their hatred in the long term.
Exactly. Nothing makes a population turn on a ruler faster than aggressively extracting their hard-earned wealth. Machiavelli says it is far better to be viewed as stingy from the beginning.
Manage expectations.
Yes. By maintaining a disciplined, austere economy, you keep the treasury full. When a crisis hits or a war starts, you have the funds to handle it without suddenly taxing the population into poverty. They might not cheer for your generosity, but they won't rebel against your taxes.
Which bridges perfectly into his most famous philosophical question. Is it better for a leader to be loved or feared?
He acknowledges that ideally, a leader would be both. But since human nature makes that almost impossible, he states unequivocally that it is much safer to be feared.
It's all about leverage, right?
Completely. Love is a fickle, voluntary emotion. People will break the bond of love the absolute second it serves their personal interest to betray you, but fear is a mechanism you control. Fear of punishment is constant and reliable. However, and this is important, Machiavelli draws a massive, bright red line here. A ruler must be feared, but they must never, ever cross the line into being hated.
How do you mathematically balance that? How do you maintain the fear of punishment without tipping over into hatred?
Machiavelli gives two very specific rules to avoid hatred. First, never seize a subject's property without a clear legal justification. And second, never harm their families or disrespect their women. He cynically notes that a man will sooner forget the death of his father than the loss of his inheritance. If you arbitrarily take what belongs to the citizens, that functional fear mutates into a deeply personal, irrational hatred. And as we saw with the cruelty principle, a hated ruler is a dead ruler.
So you have your citizen army, you have a disciplined, secure treasury. The public fears you, but their property is safe so they don't hate you. Yet ruling isn't just a math equation. You face daily, unpredictable human challenges. To survive the daily grind of power, Machiavelli says a leader essentially needs a dual personality.
You need to be able to effortlessly switch between two distinct personas, the lion and the fox.
Break the mechanics of that down for us.
The lion represents raw, terrifying brute strength. A leader must possess the sheer power of the lion to scare away the wolves, the external enemies, and internal rebels. But a lion is proud and straightforward, which means it is entirely blind to traps.
It just walks right into them.
Yes. It can be easily outmaneuvered by clever enemies. For that, you need the nature of the fox. The fox is cunning, deceptive, and deeply observant. It knows how to spot a trap and how to lay one. Sometimes a crisis requires the overwhelming force of the lion, but other times it requires the quiet, smart deception of the fox.
Yeah.
Machiavelli argues that a successful ruler must be willing to lie, break treaties, and go back on their promises if keeping those promises actively damages the state.
But if you are constantly breaking promises and acting deceptively in the shadows, won't the public eventually catch on and stop trusting you?
That is where the mastery of the fox truly lies. You do the brutal, deceitful work behind closed doors, but you must always wear the public mask of a highly moral, religious, and ethical saint.
It's all about PR.
Absolutely. Machiavelli suggests that the perception of morality is far more important than actual morality. You have to appear perfectly virtuous to the masses while doing whatever ruthless things are necessary to keep the state functioning.
But no single human has the bandwidth to see every trap and fight every wolf alone. You need an inner circle to help you process reality.
Yes, managing your advisors is the final, critical piece of the puzzle. A ruler needs highly intelligent, competent advisors who aren't afraid to tell the truth. You must reward them exceptionally well with wealth and status to ensure they don't look for better offers from your enemies.
Make them comfortable.
Exactly. But, and this is the vital mechanism, you must never let those advisors forget who actually holds the power. They provide the data, they offer the perspectives, but the final call must always be yours.
Because if they make the call, they're the ruler.
If an advisor starts making decisions for you, you have already lost the throne. The text compares this dynamic to a modern U.S. president's cabinet. The cabinet members are experts who debate and advise, but they are ultimately subservient. The president alone signs the executive order.
It sounds like Machiavelli is saying the ultimate superpower for a leader isn't physical strength or even wealth. It is total psychological flexibility. You have to be an absolute shapeshifter.
The shapeshifter, yes.
You have to be merciful when it builds loyalty, cruel when it establishes order, honest when it benefits you, and deeply deceitful when a trap is set.
Exactly, because fortune, the unpredictable nature of the world, is like a violent flooding river. When it floods, it destroys everything in its path. Machiavelli says a wise ruler doesn't wait for the rain. They build dams, levees, and canals while the water is low and the weather is fair.
You prepare.
You manage fate by being obsessively proactive. And when the flood does come, bold, daring leaders who take calculated, aggressive risks are the ones who survive, while cautious leaders who hesitate are watched away.
Does the text give a modern example of that?
It points to Elon Musk as a modern reflection of this building vast corporate empires by taking massive, seemingly irrational risks that ultimately force the market to adapt to him rather than the other way around. You must aggressively adapt to whatever the river throws at you.
Synthesizing all of this, Machiavelli essentially stripped away all the romantic mythology of leadership. From the courts of the Renaissance right up to modern global geopolitics, power simply doesn't care about our feelings or our moral ideals. It only cares about who is strong enough, flexible enough, and clever enough to hold it.
That's the cold, hard truth of his work.
And for you listening, once you understand the mechanics of these 500-year-old rules, the mask of the fox and the lion, the logic of preemptive strikes, the calculus of sudden cruelty versus lasting prosperity, you will start seeing the matrix everywhere. You will see these dynamics playing out in the evening news headlines and international treaties, and honestly, you'll probably spot them in the power struggles of modern corporate boardrooms.
It genuinely rewires how you view human organization and authority at every level. Which leaves us with a fascinating and deeply troubling question to consider after all of this.
What's that?
Well, if the mechanics of power truly require a leader to be endlessly adaptable, routinely deceptive, and occasionally incredibly cruel just to survive, is it even structurally possible for a truly morally good person to hold absolute power? Or does the nature of the system inevitably force whoever sits on the throne to eventually, out of pure survival, put on the mask of the fox?